Hi guys! Welcome to our first video for Module 5. This week we are covering Chapter 6, which is talking about the development of ballistic skills. So the main actions that we're going to be looking at are throwing, kicking, and punting, and then striking, both sidearm and overarm. So this first video is going to go through the developmental sequences of throwing specifically, and then each subsequent video will go through a different example of common ballistic skills that we can observe through the lifespan. So first we should probably define what a ballistic skill is. So it's simply when a performer applies force to an object to project it. So when we look at these applied examples, throwing, we would be projecting a ball, kicking or punting, projecting a ball but with the feet, and then sidearm or overarm striking, you are using some type of implement like a bat or a racket to then project another object into the air. Okay. So for throwing, which is kind of the center of our discussion for this video, can be done in a couple of different ways, right? We could do an underhand throw, kind of like this picture at the bottom, or we could also do an overarm throw like this picture at the top. Additionally, throws can be performed with either one hand or two hands, so there's a lot of variability within throwing as a task itself. As far as assessment, when we look at throws, we might take note of outcome measures or the product of the throw, so how accurate is the throw in relation to a target, how far is a person throwing an object. We might look specifically at the physical characteristics of the object and how fast that object is moving. We could also look at production measures, which are more related to the movement pattern, and these are the developmental sequences that we'll be observing this week. So the first couple of slides in here are going to just be like general characteristics of overarm throwing, both for early and proficient stages, and then we'll go through the developmental sequences step by step and body action by body action, as this most closely relates to what you're doing with your activity for this week. So characteristics of early overarm throwing usually are restricted to arm action only. So there's not a whole lot of body movement, not a lot of rotation, probably no step before the throw. It's very much just maybe there might be a backswing. If you guys recall from the first activity, there was a little girl who just kind of like pushed the ball in front of her, right? She would be a great prime example of the characteristics we would see in early overarm throwing. So arm action only. Usually the elbow is going to be pointed forward or up, so that's this picture down here kind of exemplifies that characteristic pretty well. Usually the throw is executed with elbow extension only, so in terms of planar movements, most of the movement is in the sagittal plane, where they're just flexing their elbow and shoulder and then extending the elbow and shoulder up to the point of ball release. Sometimes the force, depending on how much force is put into the arm movement, there might be trunk flexion or flexion at the hip. As you can see here, sometimes those lines are a little bit blurred. You could have a little bit of trunk flexion and hip flexion, one or the other. So usually this is occurring because of the force of the throw if we are doing a throw for force type goals, but it's usually not like an intentional choice. So it's a resulting movement based off of other movements in the pattern. When we get to proficient throwers, we start to notice a little bit more distinction between body parts, as in like they're moving independent from one another, but they also move in a more coordinated sequence with specific timing between events. So typically we'll see a forward step with some pelvic rotation, like we can see in these first two steps in this image down below. The upper spine will rotate backwards, kind of with the pelvis, and then we get the presence of a backswing, or the upper arm moving behind the head in some way, shape, or form. The upper arm will then inwardly rotate to get us to our extension and release phase, and then usually there's a follow through after the release. So well-developed sequences will lead to maximal force production for greater distance traveled by the object. And these are all examples of our developmental sequences if we're throwing for force. So when we look at the developmental changes in overarm throwing, there's 5 body actions that we consider, and there's a certain or general sequencing of events that will occur as someone becomes more proficient. So these are backswing, foot action, trunk action, upper arm action, and forearm action. We'll first look at the backswing, which has 4 steps in the developmental sequence. So step 1, we consider no backswing, 2, elbow and humeral flexion, 3, circular upward backswing, and 4, circular downward backswing. Now, similar to your activity last week, we have kind of this observational plan or flow chart that helps us to determine what developmental level a person might be at. So for step 1, if we're looking to see if someone has a backswing or not, the question that we ask ourselves is, does the arm move backward before moving forward? Thus the backswing, okay? If the answer is no, then your thrower is at step 1 in the developmental sequence. So, definition of no backswing would mean the ball in hand moves directly forward to release from the arm's original position. So an example of this would be that little girl from the first activity we did, where she literally has the ball, that's her initial position, and then she just pushes the ball forward. So no backward movement of the arm whatsoever. If the arm does move backward before moving forward, then we ask the question, does the hand drop below the waist? If the answer is no, we then ask the question, does the ball swing outward, upward, and around, kind of mimicking a circular movement? If the answer is no again, then we're at step 2, which we call elbow and humeral flexion. So there's this image of this little boy down here, and we can see that the ball moves away from the intended line of flight, so it's moving backwards, to a position alongside or behind the head, and then that's followed by an upward flexion of the humerus and concomitant elbow flexion, right? So that part into extension to ball release for the throw. So that's why we call it elbow and humeral flexion. It's very sagittal plane flexion extension pairing. If we answered yes to this question, so does the hand drop below the waist? No. Does the ball swing outward, up, and around? Yes. Then we're in a step 3 of the developmental sequence, in which we would say the movement pattern is circular and upward. So I do have a video that we can watch. I think I have to turn my laser pointer off to press play. Okay, so we have a fast motion first, and then a slow motion. Again, we're focusing on the backswing. Okay, so what we would notice is that the ball moves away from the intended line of flight to a position behind the head via a circular overhead movement with the elbow extended, or an oblique swing back, or a vertical lift from the hip. So the video I just showed you here, let me see. I want to control this part. Okay, so if we go really slow, this is more of an oblique movement of the humerus. Okay, so you could see how it kind of doesn't really move in a particular plane. It's kind of in between a sagittal and a frontal plane movement. But the backswing is kind of in an oblique fashion. Okay. Alternatively, we could have someone more like this example who has more of a vertical lift from the level of their hip. So you see the ball is drawn more upwards into the backswing. But both of these would kind of classify as a somewhat circular movement where the ball is moving in an upward direction. Okay. Now, the last step, if we're looking at does the hand drop below the waist, and we say yes, that would be a circular downward backswing because the arm is dropping down and back below the waist. Okay. Wait, there we go. Click next. Woo! I was like, that's not the example I wanted. So in a circular downward backswing or step 4, the ball moves away from the intended line of flight to a position behind the head via a circular down and back motion. And that's going to carry the hand below the waist specifically. So that's kind of the identifying characteristic for a step 4 classification. So we can watch this video, fast and slow. See, hand drops below the waist into a downward and backward circular motion for the throw. Then we can look at foot action. So what are the feet doing? And similar, we've got a nice little flow chart to kind of help us have an observational plan on what we're exactly looking for. So the first question, we usually watch the feet from the side and then just observe, is a step taken? If no, that's step 1, and we call it no step, right? So in this kind of image sequence here, you could see this little girl's feet pretty much do not change position. Okay, so the person throws from the initial foot position, no stepping involved. If the person does take a step, then we have to consider which foot the step is happening on. So is it on the homo or contralateral leg? Homo means same, contra means opposite. So this is in reference to the throwing arm. Okay. If we have a homolateral step, that means the person steps with the foot on the same side as the throwing arm. Okay, just ignore this picture. It's what I had to screenshot to get this flow chart separated from the total image. But in this little image sequence, this little boy, we could see he does take a step, but it's with the same leg as his throwing arm. So that would be an example of a homolateral step. If the person has a contralateral step, or they step with the opposite leg of their throwing arm, we then consider if it's a short step or a long step. And I feel like this classification is a little bit more subjective to whoever's doing the observation, but the flow chart criteria that the textbook uses is the step over half the thrower's height. If it's not, then we say we have a short contralateral step as exemplified in this video. So step with the contralateral leg here, but it's not that long. In contrast, we could have a long contralateral step, which is over half of the thrower's height or approximated. Okay. So you could see this step is a little bit longer. But I like to show this example because if you compare this video to the previous video, some people might not think that there's that big of a difference between a short and long step. So again, this classification is a little bit more subjective to the whoever's doing the observation. But usually I grade kind of loosely on foot action between steps 3 and 4 because of that reason. Okay. The next body part we can look at is the trunk. Primarily we're interested in rotary movement. So the first question we would ask in our observational plan is, are there any rotary movements? If the answer is no, we're in step 1 of the developmental sequence, which classifies as no trunk action or flexion extension. Okay, so either no rotary movement or you are only seeing flexion and extension, just to clarify. Okay, so only the arm is in active force production. That's characteristic of our early overarm throwing. And then sometimes, like I had mentioned before, the thrust of the arm kind of pulls the trunk into passive flexion. Sometimes there might be a little bit rotation opposite of the movement, but it's not going to be a notable amount of rotation. Okay. If there are rotary movements, so we say yes to the first question, then we ask, does the lower trunk or hips rotate? If the answer is no, we would say the thrower is in step 2 of our developmental sequence, particularly emphasis on upper trunk rotation. Sometimes the lower trunk may rotate. From there, we then ask, do the hips start forward before the trunk? So is there a differentiation between lower trunk movement and upper trunk movement? If the answer is no, in both of these cases, you either have block rotation or upper trunk rotation. So no to this first question is more of the upper trunk rotation. No to this second question is more of the blocked rotation. So step 2 is characterized, again, by upper trunk rotation or total block rotation, where the spine and pelvis rotate away from the intended line of flight initially, and then simultaneously begin forward rotation as a unit or a block. Okay. Sometimes only the upper spine will twist away, where the pelvis stays facing wherever the target is, so that's where you would distinguish more upper trunk rotation. But in either case, you're either moving as a whole or your lower half is not moving and your upper half is. Okay. So this one is kind of a good example. Arm backswing action does affect how much trunk rotation will occur. So because this little boy was kind of at a lower developmental level for the backswing, the trunk rotation that you might see during that phase of the movement isn't quite as apparent, but you could see where his little pant lines are, if that's like his greater trochanter in relation to his shoulder. His body is rotating in a blocked fashion. Okay. For step 3, this would be if we do have a differentiation between upper and lower trunk rotation. So usually what will happen is the pelvis precedes the upper spine in initiating your forward rotation. So the person will twist away from their intended line of ball flight, and then they begin the forward rotation with the pelvis, followed by the upper spine, which we have a good example again with this girl here. Okay, so to highlight in the video, pelvis starts to rotate, followed by the upper trunk.